while I was gone. I've actually had two people this week. I get it all the time, but I had two people this week ask me where my accent was from. It's like, I don't have an accent. And they go, yeah, you do. And it's like, well, I was south this week, so it came back a little bit. So excuse me if you think I have an accent. I don't hear one. And I listen to myself every day. Kathy, now she can do a southern accent. 2 weeks ago, we started our study on David and Goliath by looking at 1 Samuel chapters 15 and 16. Today, we are going to be going into 1 Samuel chapter 17. So if you have a Bible and you want to turn there, go right ahead. I'm not going to be showing all the scriptures like I usually do. But in 1 Samuel 17, verses 1 through 3, now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle. And they were gathered at, and excuse me if I tear these names up, Sakha, which belonged to Judah. Now, nowhere in the scriptures will we find out exactly why the Philistines and Saul and his army are doing battle. But there's two places. Here it says that they were in the city that belonged to Judah. In verse 8, we see that Goliath, he states that the Philistines had conquered this city and that it belonged to Judah. So I would classify this as kind of a stupid question because Goliath asked, after stating, we've taken your city, why are you coming to battle with us? Well, you're invading our country, you're taking one of our cities, of course we're going to battle with you, But the Philistines, like I said, had just taken one of their cities. I would think it would be safe to say that Saul has brought his army here to not only stop the Philistine advancement into Judah, but to take back the city that the Philistines had taken. So, going back onto the scripture, they encamped between Soka and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley in between them. Now I want to go back to the map that I had shown you a couple of weeks ago, just to refresh your memory of where this battle and everything's taking place. The two blue arrows here are showing Ekron and Gath. And if you remember 2 weeks ago, I talked about that the Philistines were a seagoing nation or people, and they had come across the Mediterranean and had gone to battle with Pharaoh in Egypt, and they had lost, and Pharaoh, being nice, gave them 5 cities. And 2 of the cities that they had given them was Ekron and Gath. And we'll read later that Gath is actually where Goliath was from. The next 2 cities we just talked about, Sakha and Azekah, and those were the 2 cities where the Philistines camped between. And then the black arrow is showing where this battle probably took place. It's kind of hard when you're going through and trying to match maps together. They don't show the same cities, or one's bigger, one's larger. And so it's kind of hard, and so I had to do a lot of research, and I finally found 2 maps to give us an idea of what we're going to be talking about. So this map here is showing the land of Judah in this kind of orange or yellow area. And the area that the Philistines are taking over is this red area along the Mediterranean Sea. And here's the 5 cities that, again, the Pharaoh of Egypt gave them: Gaza, Ascalon, and Ashdod. And the other one was Gath, and the other one that we looked at. But we see here, I'm pointing with these black arrows to Gezer, and down here to Lachish. And you kind of see that's kind of a line between where the Philistines are and Judah. And so on this map, I was able to find Gezer and Lachish and drew kind of a line showing this line here between the Philistines and Judah. And of course, we can see here the town that they took was in Judah. And so this is the reason I believe that they've come to battle, was to push the Philistines back into their town, or back into their territory, and to take their town back. So going back to 1 Samuel 17, 1 through 3, going to verse 2. And Saul and the men of Israel had gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel on a mountainside on the other. And again, this is the map that I had shown you 2 weeks ago, showing you a satellite view of this area. Here we have Gath, way off in the distance, where again Goliath is from. This is Sukkah that the Philistines had taken over, and Ashkelon, and they were encamped between these two cities, which would leave this mountain here, is where the Philistines were camped. Here's the valley of Elah going through here, and the Israelites were encamped on the mountain on the opposite side of the valley, so that would put them over here. And of course, you can barely see this line through here is an old creek bed or a dried up riverbed. And as we will read once we get into the battle, David stops here to pick up his 5 smooth stones to do battle against Goliath. I would guess maybe out in this area here. So in 1 Samuel 17, verses 4 through 7, we see about Goliath, and that he was considered to be a champion warrior. Now, I'm sure that being at 9 foot 6 inches in height has a lot to do with him being a champion. And I meant to get a measuring tape and find out exactly, but I'm going to guess, we'll just say that he's as high as this wall here. And he's going against David, who is a teenager. But you can imagine going to battle with somebody in hand-to-hand combat against a giant who is this tall. Okay? And I doubt that Goliath was a string bean of a giant. A lot of times when you see pictures of giants, they're tall. I mean, they're really tall, but they're skinny and kind of frail. A lot of times when they're giants like that, they have a lot of medical issues. So they can't walk a lot and everything. But I'm saying that Goliath is not that type of person. I'm thinking that Goliath was kind of like the old wrestler Andre the Giant, okay? Or even Arnold Schwarzenegger, built like that. You know, just muscles and just big and buff, and not somebody that you would want to go in one-to-one combat with, okay? Now, Goliath, not only is he 9 foot, 6 inches tall, but he's covered in armor. The first thing that we read in the scriptures is that he had a bronze helmet on. And any soldier usually is going to have a bronze helmet on. And again, it doesn't tell you what type of helmet it was, and I did a lot of researching on bronze helmets. And a lot of the helmets, they have the nose piece that comes down, protecting their nose. And then the helmet comes down. And as we'll read again in the battle, David hits him between the eyes and his forehead. So I'm assuming that the helmet probably didn't have this piece that comes down low, that it was just kind of like a skull cap. I don't know. But it had to be unprotected in order for him to be hit there by the stone. The next item that is mentioned in his armor is his coat of mail. And the coat of mail is mentioned to have weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. Now, a coat of mail is made of tiny little circles. They're about the size of your pinky, and they're interwoven. And I don't know if you can see it here, but each one is interwoven with like about 3 or 4 others that make a tight mesh. And the thing about these are 2 things. One is they're heavy. The 5,000 shekels that they say his weighed is somewhere around 150 pounds, okay, of extra weight that he's carrying around. The other thing is they're impenetrable. You can hit it with a sword. You can hit it with a spear, an arrow, and it's not going to penetrate it because of the way they're made. The only thing that would penetrate it would be a spear that had a real fine tip on it, or what they call a rapier sword, which hadn't been invented then, that would be able to go through the mail. Now the chainmail had different designs. This is kind of what they call a short-skirted chainmail, and it'd be lighter weight, and it is protecting your chest. Others had long sleeves. Others were longer, came down lower, and they also had a hoodie that you could pull over to protect your neck and your head. Again, it doesn't say what type of mail he was wearing, just that it weighed 5,000 shekels. The next piece of his armor was his bronze covering on his legs. And these are usually referred to as shin guards. Sometimes a suit of armor might have thigh guards built into them to protect your thighs. And these three items of armor, the helmet, the coat of mail, and the leg coverings, are defensive in nature. They are designed to protect the wearer or the soldier from harm from his enemy. The next items listed that Goliath carried are offensive weapons, and they are designed to inflict injury on your opponent. The first thing that it talks about is his bronze javelin. And a javelin has two purposes. One is to stab your enemy close, but far enough away, it reaches out farther than a sword would. So when somebody's coming up, he could stab them to keep them away from him. But the javelin was also designed to be thrown. And so if you were really good at it, you could throw it a great distance and hit somebody before they got to you, or hit somebody that was not expecting it. So if there was like a group of people fighting or a group coming at you, you could throw your javelin and possibly hit somebody before they got to you. Now, Goliath is carrying this bronze javelin on his back between his shoulders. Now, verse 7 goes into a little detail about the javelin or the spear, and it states that the staff of the spear was like a weaver's beam. And I looked up weaver's beam to try to get an idea of what that was, and everything that came up was showing looms where they make blankets or whatever, and the weaver's beam was actually what we'd call a thread, not a thimble, but a spool. And they're big wooden, and they have a big beam in the middle, and that is where they would wrap up all the wool or the cloth or the thread, and that's what they called a weaver's beam. And I was like, well, maybe it was just the thickness of that middle portion was what they were talking about. Well, I kept doing some research, and this picture came up, and this is actually a weaver's beam spear. And this was created during the Bronze Age. This picture states that the weaver's beam could be thrown as far as 70 yards. Now put Goliath behind that, and we might be going 100 yards or more. Okay? And this was one of the first major technical innovations to hit the battlefields of ancient Middle East. Verse 7 goes on to say that his iron spearhead attached weighed 600 shekels, which is about 5 pounds. So again, I am assuming here, but I think Goliath's javelin looked something more like this, being a weaver's beam and not a spear like you normally see, just a wooden shaft with a spearhead on it. Verse 7 ends stating that Goliath had a shield bearer with him. I'm sure the shield bearer wasn't empty-handed, so I'm assuming he had a shield. Now, the scriptures do not state that Goliath had a shield with him or on him on his arm. Was actually carrying his shield. Again, he's weighted down pretty much with his chainmail and his spear, the sword, and everything. So, but the shield bearer had two things that they did. One was to carry the shield for the opponent, but they were also assigned to, like the general or the commander, to protect him. And he might have 5 or 6, 7 shield bearers all the way around him to protect him from the enemies coming in from anywhere trying to kill their commander. But the scriptures just say that he had a shield bearer with him. And again, it doesn't give any size or dimensions or anything about his shield. Starting in verse 8, we read about Goliath taunting the children of Israel, the army of Saul. Goliath stood and cried out to the armies of Israel, and he said to them, Am I not a Philistine? Your enemy. We have conquered the Judean city of Saka, and you are the servants of Saul, the children of Israel. Why have you come out in line of battle? And again, it's kind of a stupid question because you just confessed that you took their city. Of course, they're going to come down to protect it. If he is able to fight with me, choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then the Philistines will be your slaves. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And Goliath went on to say that he defied the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. In defying the armies of Israel, Goliath is actually defying God himself. This reminds me of a comment made by an employee of the White Star Line, who were the owners of the famous Titanic during its launch on May 31st, 1911. The employee was caught up so much in the frenzy of the modern shipbuilding being so advanced that the employee made the comment that not even God himself could sink this ship. The Titanic was the largest, fastest, and most sumptuous luxury liner that had ever sailed and sunk. Its captain, Edward Smith, was blinded by his faith in shipbuilding technology that he was quoted as saying, I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. I can't conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. Modern shipbuilding has gone way past that. The ship was heralded by Bruce Ismay, the chairman of managing director of the White Star Line, as unsinkable, a claim that was echoed in the press. Never, ever defy God. Just so happens that a vital disaster wasn't needed to doom the Titanic. All that was needed to sink the Titanic was an ice cube. Very large ice cube, mind you, but that's all it was just an ice cube. So for those who don't like the movie, The Titanic, because it is too dramatized or Hollywoodized, just remember that you can pull a biblical fact or truth from the Titanic. This tragic event proved the power of God. I'm not saying that God pushed that iceberg into the path of the Titanic and killed all those people just to prove a point, but it does prove a point. My point is we shouldn't provoke God or blaspheme God or defy God by questioning his power, his godliness, or his existence. So Goliath is taunting the armies of Saul to pick one man to walk out into the valley of Elah and fight him 1-to-1, hand-to-hand, man-to-man, in combat for the win, for the victory. There are two battle strategies or points of war that I want to point out here. The first is to always take the high ground whenever possible. You never give up the high ground. Both of these waiting armies know this very important fact of war. They're both standing on mountaintops. They don't want to give up that high ground. And Goliath is hoping that by going down there and taunting the people, that Saul's army will come down to fight him, and then they will have won because they will have the high ground. So these two armies are not wanting to give up. They're not wanting to give up that high ground. During World War II in the Pacific, the U.S. would spend days and spend countless lives trying to take a mountain on an island away from the Japanese because they knew the importance of that mountain. During during the Civil War, a very dramatic, gruesome, and fatal war was fought on Malvern Hill, a plateau with elevation in Virginia. The hill was only about 150 feet high, about a mile and a half long, and 3/4 of a mile wide. But the Union Army knew that was going to be a very strategic place to take. And the Union Army took that plateau, that hill. And when the Confederate armies came up to fight it, they couldn't, because they had the low ground. They were going uphill constantly, and they were defeated because the Union had the high ground. The historian Douglas Southall Freeman wrote, "It was altogether an exceedingly formidable position. Had the Union engineers searched the whole countryside below Richmond, Virginia, they would not have found ground more ideally set for the slaughter of an attacking army. Take the high ground and never give it up." Of course, there's another reason to never give up the high ground. Never give up on God. Never deny God. And especially never defy God. Having God in your life gives you a distinct advantage in dealing with your daily war against the devil. Remember what Peter stated in 1 Peter 5, verses 6 through 11. "Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you, build you up, and bring you up in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the whole world. But may the God of all grace, who called us to his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a little while, perfect, established, strengthen, and settle you. To him be the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen." Remember, and I keep bringing this up, the devil is out there. He's searching around. He's roaming around like a lion, seeking whom he may devour. And by us always devoting our life to God, by always remembering that higher ground, and never giving up that higher ground, we can defeat the devil. The second battle strategy that the Philistines are employing here was the advantage that they had of Goliath. They were going to use that advantage to the fullest. Their very big and strong battle-trained advantage to their advantage. So why not cut our losses and go man on man against Goliath? They are betting on the army of Judah not having a man that could match Goliath in height, strength, or fighting knowledge. Goliath can go down and kill one man, and we'll take the children of Israel as our slaves. And of course, the flip side of that, if Goliath was defeated, then they would become slaves. But they weren't thinking about that. We've got Goliath. We've got a sure bet. He's not going to lose. Goliath can go down and kill one man. Not to mention, we will gain all of their cities and their riches as our own and make them our slaves. Remember, the Philistines only had 5 cities making up the coastal region that we just looked at on the Mediterranean Sea that was given to them by the Pharaoh of Egypt. This one win would probably triple their landmass in their cities. All it took was one win. We need to always use our advantage of the Bible and prayer to our advantage, our common enemy, the devil. The Philistines' battle strategies were working. Verse 11 tells us that Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistines. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. Being dismayed, according to Webster, is experiencing or showing feelings of alarm, concern, or being upset or worried, or agitated because of some unwelcome situation or occurrence. Having Goliath stand down in the valley, cursing God, and demanding a soldier to march down and fight him in hand-to-hand combat to determine the outcome of the war, was one of those type of agitated feelings. The future children of Israel would fit the bill as a really big, unwelcome situation or occurrence. But I want to point out here one huge fact that Saul and his army is forgetting. They have God on their side. In Romans 8:31, what then shall we say to these things? What shall we say to this 9-foot, 6-inch tall giant standing down in the valley, looking up at us, taunting us, making fun of us, and defying our God? What Goliath is doing is testing their faith in their God. Do you see that? Goliath is stating that he is bigger and badder than their God. And Saul and his army believe it. You see, Saul and his army are looking at the physical that's standing in front of them instead of the spiritual that they should have inside of them. They are letting Goliath's talk, his size, his armor, get into their head. They are actually letting Satan get into their head as fear and making them doubt their faith in God. Goliath and Satan are winning this battle before it even starts. In Romans 8:31, the second part of Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who can be against us? Saul and his army are, to use a term from today, shaking in their boots with fear. So what then shall we say to these things? What shall we say to our Goliaths that we face today, that we faced yesterday, that we faced last week? What shall we say when the devil tries to get us to doubt our faith? What shall we say when we let the physical stand in the way of our spiritual walk with God? Romans 8:31 has the answer. If God is for us, who can be against us? Anything is possible with God for us. We can face any giant in our life with God in our corner. It doesn't matter what that giant is, whether it's somebody at work, it doesn't matter. We all have giants, but they're nothing when we have God on our side. Satan doesn't stand a chance when God is standing beside us on the mountainside and we are facing our loudmouth giant of a warrior. But Saul and his army, they don't see this fact. They are concentrating on the physical size of Goliath. They are concentrating on his physical, do or die. This is what you've got to do. And if you lose, you're mine. Okay? That's all they see. They can't get past their fear of losing or dying against the size and strength of Goliath. So they sit in the camp doing nothing. Maybe they think Goliath will go away if nobody goes out there into the valley. Or maybe the Philistines will come up and give us a surefire win if they decide to give us their high ground advantage and go down into the valley and try to fight uphill. Okay? I don't know what Saul was thinking. But I know what he wasn't thinking. He wasn't thinking that God is on my side, and with God, we can defeat this. Brothers and sisters, we can't cower to fear. We can't give in to the devil and fear. We can't let fear rule our lives. We can't bow down to Satan, and we can't let our giants, whatever they are, take over our life. There's an old saying that hindsight is 20/20. And I'm not talking about last year, even though that's included in our hindsight. But we can look back at our past and see where we made our mistakes that put us where we are today. Maybe it wasn't a mistake, but a decision that you made. Maybe to quit a job or to move to another town. Maybe it was buying a car or a house. Whatever that decision was, whether it was good or bad, that decision put you where you are today. And maybe that decision made you the person that you are today. Maybe you were slow in making the decision, and because of that, you have a tendency to jump to conclusions today. Whatever happened from the past minute back started making your decisions and helped you to define who you are today. But from this moment on, your decisions will define who you are tomorrow and the next day and the next. Yes, the decisions you made in the past will still have a lasting effect on your tomorrow, but you can't change what happened in the past. You can change what happens tomorrow and today. So remember that with God on your side, nobody stands against you, and that you are capable of doing all things through Christ who strengthens you. Before we end this morning, I want to take a quick look at 7 quotes that I found about the future. Eleanor Roosevelt was brought up in this morning's class. The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. Soren Kierkegaard, life can only be understood backwards, but we must be lived forwards. Okay. Gandhi, the future depends on what we do in the present, and that is true. Victor Kayam, even if you fall on your face, you're still moving forward. I like that one. You're still moving forward, even though you fall on your face. Remember that one. Drake, whoever he is, no matter how dirty your past is, your future is still spotless. And then Peter Drucker, the only thing we know about the future is that it will be different. And I disagree with Peter on this fact. Because if we don't change what we're doing, our past or our future can still be the same as it is today. Okay? So I disagree with that statement. And then Abraham Lincoln, the best thing about the future is that it comes one day at a time. So don't get caught up in what's going to happen next week, what's going to happen next month, what's going to happen next year. We kind of have a tendency to do that with everything that's going on in our society today. Let's think about it one day at a time. And when I read that quote from Abraham Lincoln, it made me think of James 4, verses 13 and 14. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, and we'll buy and sell and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen today or tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Not to say that we can't make plans for today, or make plans for tomorrow or next week. But we need to understand that we're not guaranteed another breath. We're not guaranteed another breath. But we need to remember these things as we read through. And you've got homework again for next week. I want you to read 1 Samuel 17. We're going to be talking about the battle of David and Goliath again. But we need to remember and look at these things that we're reading and how they impacted. One man is defying God. One man is stopping Saul and his army in their tracks because of his physical being. We can't let that stop us, brothers and sisters. We can't let that stop us with the giants that we face on a daily basis. We need to get past them. We need to look into the spiritual, and we'll get into that next week. But we need to get past those things. And we can do it because we have God on our side, and we can do anything with God on our side. Anything. It doesn't matter how big that giant is that you're facing. We can do it. And we can do it together. You don't need to face your giants alone. And that's one thing that we are here for. Just come forward and let your giants be known. And we'll pray about it. And we'll encourage you. Or maybe you haven't put Christ on in baptism. And you see that's something that you need to do. And we can take care of that sin problem today. And help you and get you on the path so that you have God on your side. All we ask is that you let your wishes be known as together we stand and sing.